I could spend the rest of my life just reading.
Hello and welcome to Sundoku, the program for people who think of a library as a home away from home. I'm Kath Keneally, and today's program features poet and short fiction writer Michael Farrell. He's based in Melbourne and he publishes with Giramondo Press, and his new book is The Victoria Principle. As a poet, Michael Farrell has been writing and drawing attention and awards for 25 years or more, but he's lately extended into the short pieces that turn up in this book, which I'm talking about with him today. If I run through some titles, you'll get a hint of the flavour, which is a real tutti fruity mix, so try these on for size. Thinking about ornithophobia, the invisible paddocks, relational Jesus, impatience is not a virtue, nude writing retreat in Nova Scotia, and excuses not to arm wrestle. All right, we began by discussing the first story in the collection, Thinking About Ornithophobia, which is the theme that the narrator of the story is considering for an issue of a journal called Desert Rat, and he's thinking about famous people who feared and hated birds like Eminem and David Beckham and Scarlett Johansson. And we're off.
I suppose I've just been using the framework of the story to write things and to kind of like to say some things that I've been thinking about poetry or even about art or movies or whatever.
And the first piece in the collection introduces us to Val, who's also a writer, and he's being offered a gig editing a magazine issue. And he's tossing around the idea of ornithophobia as a theme, and it's neatly tied up by the first offers to the proposed edition arriving in his inbox. But it leads us there via Val's childhood and recent life, including another spill in a clinic, which is just mentioned and passed off. So I wonder how you decide when a story's filled itself up enough with incidents and reflections and philosophy and snapshots.
Yeah, like the first three are more about my life at that time and, yeah, like my experiences with clinics do get referred to coming out of COVID, and I kind of got to this idea of just, which has got to do often with what magazines want, of getting to 2,000 words. So I kind of aim at 2,000 words, and then I feel like, have I got more to say? Have I got more to go? Is it still going? And sometimes when I go through and edit them, they get a little bit longer, but mostly they're between 2,000 and 3,000 words, yeah.
I did love that story, and it did seem to be autobiographical, and you didn't seem to be bothered about it seeming to be autobiographical. That seemed fine. And then that story about stories and storytelling is the invisible paddocks told in the first person. I'd just like you to talk about that a bit, especially the framing device of a storyteller at a library, and then the colonial miracle, which is the fantastical salvation of a threatened farming family. It's a gorgeous story. And again, it obviously has autobiographical bits in it. You mention a sister and brother Darren, and then in brackets Wayne in the story.
I mean, some of that is autobiographical, and I mean, Darren and Wayne, neither of them are names of my brothers. Well, they're actually names of my cousins. But, I mean, I was under the influence of Steele Rudd to some extent. I had read a selection of his stories fairly recently, and I just love the kind of, it's kind of like a hyperbole of event or something like that. It's just like the farm just seems to be in chaos all the time. Yeah. And it's kind of comedic. It's not like a Henry Lawson kind of idea of many other colonial writers who've written about farming, the 19th century farmer and how they struggled against drought and to try and make a living on the land. You know, if they weren't squatters with thousands of acres or whatever, and I find them hilarious, and that's why I put in like things like the snake plague or whatever, and the idea of, you know, like the bank can't foreclose on the land because they're kind of beaten off by the snakes or whatever, and I don't know where some of it came from, but sort of like partly the plot is structured around the narrator like trapping, and I used to do rabbit trapping when I was a kid on the farm, and there I would be wandering off just with my own thoughts because there's no one around, and the farm was surrounded by native forests, so I would just think of things happening out of the ordinary, except nothing ever really did. But yeah, I was kind of impressed by the achievement of that idea that I thought of, which is influenced by the impasse I think that we're been at for a long time of like who owns the land and what's the right relation to the land if it's not theirs, etc., etc.
Yes.
And then the other thing of like just the settler problem on its own of like trying to survive in the kind of steel rud kind of scenario or whatever. So I created this farm or part of a farm or paddocks or whatever that are not on the land. They're hovering above, and you can get up there, and it's kind of magical, and you don't struggle up there. You're not on Indigenous land either. So, yeah, it's quite a miraculous sort of story in a way.
A lot of the tellers of the story are battling depression and illness quite valiantly and self-deprecatingly, quite amusingly even. And relational Jesus is a case in point where Viv toys with the Catholicism he's been brought up in and recalls experimenting with Ayurvedic practice and thus evading the Protestantism that passed for the secular in Australia. He thinks about it all quite deeply, and then he remarks to a friend as they're passing a church and looking at a crucifix that it's the droopiest Jesus that he's ever seen, not like the one in the church at Bombala, which is where you grew up. And I love these delightful contrasts of tone where we're dropping into a depression and coming back up to a joke, and somehow it all ties together in a very palatable way. Is that deliberate?
Well, I guess it's me in a sense. Like, I mean, it is my depression that I'm talking about, but I don't want it to be a kind of... Yeah, I want to try and deal with it at some sort of remove and to not... I don't want it to be about my depression, you know, like that's sort of something that I just want to think about and be honest about. But it also fascinated me that when I came out of I still battle with depression, but I had a serious breakdown before I wrote those stories, and I was just fascinated by what that did to my mind, especially in terms of like religion, and feeling like drawn back to the church and feeling like... Well, I'm reminded of Heidegger's quote, "Only a God can save us," and that's kind of like how I felt in breakdown, that I would just be calling on Jesus in a way, because I had chronic insomnia, and I would just be like clinging to the bed like I was on a raft basically at night, just feeling like I was going to fall off really, and I couldn't sleep, and it was horrible. Yeah, so, you know, there's a kind of like rich aspect to that, I think, as well, and part of it is my not being able to write at that time, so there's kind of like, in a way, it's like a memory of what happened to me in terms of imagery and imagination, I suppose.
I would say that every story is pretty much loaded with cultural references and allusions and jokes, and that you are addressing a literature and theory cognizant audience, I guess. What about the story "Real Estate Agents Wish Governments Would Do More," where the author steps forward immediately to say why he's called his three agents David for talk poet David Anton, John for musician poet John Cage, and Marjorie for poetry critic Marjorie Perloff? And then the reader sits up and girds her loins and thinks, right, we're in for a ride. But then the three of them begin discussing the homeless and the activist targeting of Starbucks and the picketing of house auctions in Fitzroy. And we're often half thinking all the time that is Marjorie Perloff complaining. You seem to love tripping up our conditioned reflexes as readers.
You know, I just like to try different things within the one story, and so, and to kind of like challenge myself in terms of like how do you manage different levels of narration or characterization, or like it's not autobiographical in that it's a kind of like comedy about an estate agency, but it was provoked by my being evicted and the scarcity of rental places and the way rents were being hiked in the last couple of years. And I've just felt like, everyone's protesting about things happening overseas, etc. Why aren't people just like protesting outside real estate agencies, you know, because they're the, you know, they seemed as evil as anybody else to me at that time, at least. And and they're kind of, you know, conveniently situated where they don't, you know, they're kind of like the bland, they're sort of like they're between you and the property owners, you know, and they're kind of like part of the community. I mean, you know, my agent was like their office is quite close to, I went past it quite often, you know, but I never went in there and yelled at them or like threw anything at the window or anything like that. But I just didn't see why no one did that. You know, they're just like sitting there safe in their office. They're just like trying to be, you know, legal and professional and everything, but they don't. It's kind of like an ironic title, basically, because I think real estate agents could do more for their tenants, basically. They're nice when they come and inspect, but they actually don't do anything for you.
What does it get you in terms of being the author of this story to cast them as the characters you cast them as?
Well, I didn't want to make them, I guess, agents of evil. That's kind of like, it became more like a Barbara Pym scenario, if any of your listeners know who that is. I mean, and I mean, I've watched Stath's Flats, I think is hilarious. Like, it's a British sitcom about a real estate agency. So those things were in my head as well.
Yeah. When we look at the stories, some of them are, as the blurb suggests, thought stories. They're kind of accounts of what's going through your brain. I really liked Excuses Not to Arm Wrestle. That encapsulates what you can do with a runaway thought, I think. Could you just flick through what happens in that story? Read a bit if you like.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Excuses not to arm wrestle. Bill, not his real name, was on his accustomed lunch break at the university swimming pool. He would eat his lunch after the break at his computer. He was tanned and a tad fleshier than he would have liked to be, drying himself off after a swim and a shower in the change room. As he did so, he noticed a nasty-looking scar that ran down the arm of the young Chinese-Australian man, presumably a medical student, from his apparent youth and uniform, opposite him. He couldn't explain the structure of the change room facilities without a drawing, but it was designed so that pool users stood opposing each other when changing. "That looks savage," said Bill. "Oh, it's 2 years old," the student replied. "Did you get a rod put in?" asked another student on the other side of the changing structure. "It's a fracture from an arm wrestling match with a friend." "Wow," said Bill, "a great story, especially for your friend to tell." Although he supposed as he left the change room, glad that he had spoken to the student and availed himself of the anecdote to perhaps use in a story, or at least to add to his next conversation with a friend, it depended on the listener. Perhaps the victim story would be more appealing to some. These were, Bill supposed, momentarily the best excuses for not arm wrestling. "No, I'd love to, but I actually broke my arm in a wrestling match last time I tried it." "Yes, well, I like to, but the last time I arm wrestled, I broke my friend's arm." He was the type who was never satisfied with absolute claims, however, and only used them as a stepping stone to new thoughts.
And the rest of that story just goes on with more and more fantastic excuses that you might offer to somebody who challenges you to an arm wrestle.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting cultural act, like it's not something that's common, but it's not unusual, and it could pop up anywhere in any situation where people have an arm each. It's a feat of strength, but it's also suggests something about feats of masculinity and all kinds of things. And it brings up feelings of just competitiveness and, yeah, lots of things that I was thinking about, and I can't remember what's in the story now, and I often find reading them in public a discovery in a way because I've forgotten the whole thing. And I mean, when I had my breakdown, I had B12 deficiency and I had no strength. So I can't remember if I talk about that's in there. Yeah, so that makes sense of like, well, feats of strength. Feat of strength for me was like going for a walk when I did not want to go for a walk.
A couple more things. I did find a lot of the stories really funny, and in Bird Trouble and quite a few others, you just let yourself go with long list of puns and wordplay on song titles and band names and things. Or that extended discussion between Troy and Marvell on the rare birds of the avant-garde and how vorticists have been spotted in Campbelltown or wherever. But Bird Trouble, I thought, had a really lovely formal balance to it with the phrase on the wing in the opening and closing sentences. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that story. It's a terrific story. It's a band called Bird Trouble. Two guys, Dale and Ken, I think. They seem to be big in maybe the early 90s. They end up in Indonesia. They adopt a little Albanian refugee boy. They bring him up together as a gay couple in Indonesia. He ends up in Australia, the boy Ivan, becoming a sort of musician but doing a creative writing course. And the narrator follows them all the way through as a sort of a friend and ends up visiting Ivan back in Indonesia, where he's become a para-musician. And then the final sentence again has something, them looking at birds together, the narrator and Ivan, and something about the grey birds on the wing or on the grey wing of a tree or something. I just thought it was an amazing story. I just want to hear what you want to say about it.
I mean, in a way, I suppose it kind of works as a companion to the first story, which is about ornithophobia, which was about its opposite. Anyway, it wasn't about being bird phobic, but it was thinking about other people being bird phobic, and that's about like looking at birds during lockdown and stuff. Yeah. And this is quite different. It's more metaphorical, I suppose, and it's more based on my sort of like obsessions with music and bands from the 90s, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I love that sort of like that extra kind of poetic fun or whatever you can have in a story. If you have things like songs or whatever, you can name things that you like, or you like the sound of their songs, or you can make them up. You can do either, you can do both. And so I was able to, throw in a bit of casual or ironic or whatever music criticism, but also some fanning, and then, and also kind of like, I guess, toy with, the possibilities of avoiding Orientalism, and like, it's like I'm setting part of it in Indonesia, but I've got white characters, and I'm trying to deal with that in a light way with the boy, and that makes it possible for me to talk about families in a different way, and people from a white foreigner who's been brought up in Indonesia is not going to be able to fit smoothly into Melbourne University. And, in some ways, I suppose I have not similar feelings, but, like if you grow up in a country town, you don't necessarily fit into Melbourne University. But, that's a cliche in a way as well, who fits into what? No one.
And in fact, the government steps in because he's on like a version on Triple J. And he gets known And the immigration authorities step in and think, oh, well, better check this guy's papers and try to send him away. But where do they send him? Where's he from? And Albanese steps in and rescues him from that fate, which was delightful, I thought.
I guess there's lots of just different tropes in a way of like things to do with migration and deportation and what powers people have and what generosity can be.
All of that, that's where the compression of short story is the magic thing, because all of that is just tied up in 2,000 words or whatever.
Yeah.
We're making it sound heavier than it is. It's lightly done. I suppose finally I thought I'd just refer to the back cover blurb and wondered if you were comfortable with that it claims that you offer inflections and reflections, is it, on queer Catholicism and mental breakdown amidst the contradictions and ironies of contemporary Australian life? I mean, is that kind of what you think you're doing?
I guess that's one aspect. I mean, I feel like you couldn't describe the book. You'd have to put the whole book on the outside as well. I don't know, it's like people need indexes, I suppose. And, I mean, contradictions and ironies of contemporary Australian life, I mean, that means that you can write anything forever, you know. I suppose it comes up with that boring old question of how Australian is it or whatever. It's mostly set in Australia, but our minds are full of things that aren't from Australia, or they're in Australia because they're, you know, got into your mind, but although it might have got into your mind while you were in another country.
Yeah. And I think in your case, because I think you say in one of the stories that when he or I hadn't got a lover or a pet, reading is his life, and your reading is global. So yes, it's Australian. It's an Australian mind that's globally attuned.
Yeah, and we don't all have to be Protestants posing as secularists or activists or whatever. I mean, I guess most writers are writers because of the contradictions in their formation, I suppose, and trying to make sense of those things. And I'm not just trying to make sense of them, I'm trying to have fun with them.
That was poet and prose writer Michael Farrell. And probably the one thing you'll have taken away from that chat is how omnivorous his brain is. As the blurb on the back of the book says, we can think of his stories as thought stories rather than short stories, and they offer angles on mental breakdown, classical and popular myths, family and contemporary Australian life, and queer Catholicism. The Victoria Principle is a Giramondo Press title published in 2025. I'm Kath Keneally. Catch you next time on Sundaku. This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Sarah Martin,
Annie Hastwell,
Michaela Andreev,
And me, Kath Keneally. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to find out more about the books and authors featured in this program, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast, which is TSUNDOKU cast.